Hello and welcome to Deep Down. I'm your host Jordan Hunt, and this second season I'm going to be having some conversations with like-minded artists, composers, musicians and friends of mine to have a chat about the creative process and what goes on behind the scenes, what drives a musician's soul, what drives an artist's motivation. Today I've got my friend Steven Daverson, who I studied composition with at the Royal Northern College of Music. He has a new piece being performed at the Barbican Centre in February by the BBC Symphony Orchestra. So I'm going to take this opportunity to have a catch up with him and to hear more about what has been going on for him for the past 20 years since we were studying together. And I hope you find the rest of it interesting. Hello, Steven Daverson.
Hello.
You are, I was going to say, a very old colleague of mine, but not that old. You're younger than me. Can you introduce yourself to people who might not know you?
Yeah, so I am Steven Daverson. I'm a composer. I've been living in London for about 18 years. Jordan and I were colleagues back in the day at the Royal Northern College of Music,
Yes.
where we did our undergraduate degrees, and I now teach composition at the RNCM.
Yeah, full circle.
Yeah.
That's nice. How does it feel to be back there after not all this time, but after having been away and had a career?
Yeah, it's really nice. I think the teaching is important. I think it's a really sort of key part of being a composer for me. The people who made me a composer were so supportive and were some amazing people. And why wouldn't I want to be like them, effectively?
And are they still at the Northern?
Yeah, David Horn, our teacher.
I guess that's probably why we spoke to each other and hung out more than the average composers, because composers seem to be quite lonely by nature, or that they at least lean into the solitude for their work. But because we were both being taught by David, we would definitely had stuff to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. For me, I'd not had any composition lessons before I got to the Northern,
Yeah.
not formal composition lessons.
No, nor had I actually.
And I think it was really useful for me to just talk to another composer who, we had that shared connection, and just to hear that from somebody who was later in their degree and understood the landscape a little bit better.
I was so old and wise compared to you.
I-
Spring chicken.
Yeah, I mean, untold sophistication of somebody who had been in Manchester for 4 years.
Yeah,
3 or
plus
4
all the
years.
other years before that.
Yeah, of
Being from the
course.
north.
Yeah, well, being from Northampton, little Midlands town, it felt like I say, untold, unfettered sophistication.
What do you think of Northampton now? Do you think of it fondly? Do you ever go back?
Now, not especially.
Mm.
If I'm honest, in a lot of ways, Northampton has been a playground for junior politicians,
All right.
and it has suffered.
Oh gosh. Sounds like summing up the UK
Yeah,
quite nicely
to
there.
an extent. No, Northampton is not a great deal of fun
Right.
at the moment, I don't think. I'm not terribly sorry to
Not be there.
have moved.
Yeah. So, but you've been in London for 18 years.
Yeah.
Is that just a default setting, as composers do go to the big smoke?
I've always loved London.
Yeah.
Even as a kid, coming to London was a little bit sort of magical. I remember the first time I came to London, and we'd taken the Jubilee line, and we got to Charing Cross station, and coming out of the tube exit in that corner of Trafalgar Square, and you can imagine a 7-year-old
Yeah.
from Northampton is coming onto the corner of Trafalgar Square and seeing Nelson's Column and the National Gallery and
Yeah.
Canada House, just being like, what is this?
Glamour.
I know. And every time I go to Charing Cross now, if I'm leaving
Yeah.
the tube at Charing Cross, I try to use that exit.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, just that little frisson.
Yeah. London does still have that special glamour. If you allow it.
You have to remind yourself how
Yeah.
special it is at times.
Because you can end up just keeping your head down. And I mean, I don't know anyone who lives like actually in central London. I have a friend whose family lives in Bloomsbury in kind of an old council house that's effectively a townhouse looking onto the British Museum. And going there for cups of tea when I was a student was just like incredibly glamorous.
Yeah.
But when then would one ever feel like one's living really, really central? Like we're all kind of on the outskirts.
Yeah, I've been in East London as long as I've been here,
Yeah.
in the same sort of area.
I mean, to paint a picture for anyone who's listening, we are in your studio,
Yes.
which is very nice, very, very smart, and
I'm glad you like it.
yeah, not at all put together. Although I assume you tidied before we came,
I had a whip round.
but it feels like a proper working space
Yeah.
in a way that I don't think I've ever had or committed to myself to have a studio like this as a composer. I have a little teaching room, which feels I deserve that because I literally have to make my money by the hour, kind of inviting people around. It's not much bigger than this, but this feels like a real indulgence and sanctuary.
Yeah, I mean, I teach in here too.
Okay.
I do some of my teaching online, and
So it earns its keep.
it earns its keep. It feels like I need this kind of space to shut the door on work occasionally.
Okay.
Because for a long time, like lots of people, I was in a flat where it was just one room, and
Right. Yes.
you have your desk, and then your bed is round the corner, and you wake up, and the first thing that you see in the morning is your desk.
Yeah. Whatever you were working on yesterday.
Yeah. And sometimes you just need to not stare at it and have it haunt you
Right.
all day. I need that disconnection.
Distance.
Yeah. So when I'm in here,
Yeah.
I'm in here.
Yeah.
And when I'm not, I'm not.
Right.
And I can put it out of my mind as much as any musician puts music out of their mind.
Does it keep you up at night?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm somebody who will maybe go to bed 1 or 2.
That's quite late.
It is quite late, yeah. I need to do something about it, if I'm honest. But I am somebody who functions better in the evening.
Do you work that late?
Sometimes, if I need to.
Really?
Yeah, I find that the notes come when the notes come.
Gosh, that's very romantic.
Well,
I get the idea.
yeah.
But I'm not quite sure I've ever followed through with committing to, oh, they're there, so I'm going to capture them. Probably should.
Well, sometimes it is just a job, and you write the notes because you've got a deadline and somebody's emailing you saying, "Where's my score, please?"
Oh, if only I had those emails.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for.
Sure.
I'm a very slow composer.
Right. I was going to ask you about your process. Do you just have to turn up every day and chip away at it, or do you have phases of...
Both.
Right.
Yeah, sometimes I will chip away every day and just do little bits. I try to get 15 to 20 beats a day, which doesn't seem like very much.
So, for example, like 5 bars of 4/4. Is that what you mean by beats?
Yeah, thereabouts.
I know. I can imagine from your music, having seen the scores, which are so gorgeous and aesthetic, that you're not thinking necessarily in 4/4.
No, I'm not thinking in 4/4, but that's part of what I mean. When I say to students, I want to see 60 beats by next week, I don't want somebody to be doing a bar of, I don't know, 1/1.
1/1.
And
that's quite impractical for anyone who doesn't know.
It is quite impractical.
About how to read music.
It's really hard to measure what a decent amount of music is.
To feel, do you mean in terms of feeling satisfied?
Yeah, in terms of how productive is productive. I find that if I've got 15 beats of music that I'm actually going to keep, then that's pretty good going for me.
Yeah.
I know people who can just rattle off 20, 30, 40 beats a day.
Are you not convinced that they mean it?
No, it's just that they have a fluency that I don't know if I've cultivated that.
I remember when I was studying at the Royal Northern College of Music with David Horn, our mutual teacher,
Illustrious mentor.
that he would say things like, oh, just bring 5 minutes of orchestral music by next week, which, thinking about it now, is a ridiculous amount of music. I have not written 5 minutes of orchestral music in 1 week since I was a student. And I always remember him saying, this is the most time you'll ever have to compose. Let's be real. And it really was. I didn't believe him at the time. I thought, oh, let's have this kind of freedom to just indulge.
Yeah, that is something that I think every teacher says it. I know, my dad said to me at every summer holiday, you will never have this much time again.
Yeah.
Because I think every parent says it, don't they? And it's the luxury of the student or the kid to be like, yeah, okay, and it's my time to fritter away.
Yeah.
I don't remember David saying to me that he needed 5 minutes of orchestral music that week.
It was probably because he knew me. He knew how gorgeous
Yeah.
it was, and he was just trying to push me out of my comfort
He would have
zone.
been grateful for 3.
Yeah. It's just more of a challenge.
Yeah, of course.
He hit the nail on the head. He knew what I needed.
Yeah. I think our teachers were very good at knowing how to motivate us.
I imagine our motivations are different.
Probably.
I mean, we are totally different people
Yeah.
and make music for different reasons, probably. What do you need to motivate you at this stage, knowing yourself?
I like a deadline.
Yes.
Love a deadline.
That's it, isn't it, really? An external force that drives you.
I'm a master procrastinator. I think lots of composers are.
I think most humans are.
Yeah. I like that additional pressure that stops me overthinking. I know this is a particular thing that you've talked about. Being able to just ruminate on whether this particular collection of notes is exactly how I want it. And sometimes the first answer is the right one.
Generally is, yeah.
It generally is.
With some experience and some perspective in retrospect. Yeah, it's generally, it generally was right first time.
Yeah. And then you look at the details and think, oh, hang on, this little object lasts, what, a second and a half, if I'm lucky?
When you say object, you mean a little bit of music?
A little bit of music, a little gesture, a little flurry of something. And it's taken you however long to write this, and you've poured over every combination. You're like, it's gone in the blink of an eye. You want it to be beautiful, but nobody is going to ruminate on it
as much as you.
The way that you have.
There might be that one person out there.
Yeah, there'll be some. Yeah, I'd love to think that there'll be some musicologist digging this out of a Bavarian library in 150 years who will think this is nourishing stuff.
Yeah, it's worth them spending the same 6 weeks looking into it as you probably spent making it.
Yeah. Look, I work hard on this music, and I know that I work my players hard too. This is not easy.
No, it's not.
It is not. I don't apologise for it. I think that when you see a piece of mine, you don't look at this and just think, oh, well, this is something he's dashed off in a weekend. You can sense the efforts that have gone into it.
Yeah.
And
I'd agree.
And the fact that you've thought about, actually, this is for this instrument. This isn't just a collection of notes. Oh, it's a high bit. I suppose I'll stick it on a flute. It's a flute part. And if it were going to be on an oboe, it would be written differently.
And is that something you've learned over time? Or did you always think that way about writing for specific instruments as people?
It was always that way.
That's nice.
I grew up playing in youth orchestras.
Yeah. You played bassoon?
Yeah, I'm a fallen bassoonist. But I also play contrabassoon a lot as well.
Very niche. That's an enormous bassoon, right?
Yeah.
It makes a very low farty noise.
Yes, it's an octave lower than the bassoon. And it's a beautiful thing. Ravel writes for it amazingly.
Yeah.
One of the other things with the contrabassoon is that people forget about it, or they think it's a very special sound that they don't want to overuse, or whatever it is. So you get a lot of bars rest. I was never great at counting bars rest. So I used to sit with the score, and we were doing, Ravel, Shostakovich, Strauss, Elgar, all the, the big 19th century classics, as well as a couple of 20th century more recent pieces. We did some John Adams, we did some Cancelli,
In
which
your
was
youth
really
orchestra?
important. Yeah, in
Wow.
Northamptonshire County Youth Orchestra.
Is this with you as a bassoonist or contrabassoonist? Or both?
I remember, I think it was Shostakovich 10. Has that really long first movement where it's only the strings for the first 5-6 minutes. The contrabassoon part just says tacit until figure R.
Which is probably a while in.
It's a while in, and it doesn't really tell you how you would ever know when you've reached figure R.
Oh, there's no cue.
No, not really.
So this is just for context, you're in an orchestra with like 8 people playing, and your instructions just say tacit, which means shut up.
Don't play anything.
Don't play anything. But just at some point, you'll start playing.
Yeah. At some point, it will be appropriate for you to start making some sounds.
How funny.
So obviously, I had the score. And because the bassoons are sat effectively in the middle of the orchestra, it was, I mean, these are incredible orchestration lessons. You play Ravel, Rimsky-Korsakov, Stravinsky.
Yeah. That's a kind of lesson that lots of composers will never have had.
Never have.
Were those moments like kind of the first inklings of you being a composer, do you think?
I suppose so. I think it was also that there were some pieces that I played in orchestra that I really didn't like, and I thought I could do better.
Ah, that's a good motivator.
Yeah. I still don't like Tchaikovsky.
Really?
Yeah.
What element of Tchaikovsky do you not love?
I just think it's like primary colours children's music.
I love it. Yeah. That's probably why I love it.
The Nutcracker is amazing with the dances.
Yeah.
To see the Nutcracker live is incredible.
Sure.
You know, the show is amazing, but I do not want to play that stuff. I get why people love it.
He has his shtick. So you said you don't want to play it. Was there a point where you decided, I want to stop playing? Like, did you make a decision to stop playing bassoon? Or was it just that composing took over?
I think, composing took over. I went to Manchester to be a composer. I wanted to be a composer.
Yeah.
And to study composition.
That was your undergrad, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have my bassoon. I still have my bassoon.
Yeah.
It's in the other
gathering
room now.
dust.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lovely thing. I use it for teaching occasionally. I went intending to have more bassoon lessons.
You attended the Northern expecting to keep it up?
To an extent, yeah. I knew that I wasn't going to have loads of formal tuition in bassoon, but I knew that I could play well enough to at least hold my own in a couple of wind bands.
Yeah. And probably you'd be a really useful addition to a contemporary ensemble.
Yeah, actually playing certain pieces of new bassoon music, like solo pieces, just for myself has been really instructive. Just to keep the physicality of it and understand certain kinds of techniques that are really hard to get your head around.
Yeah.
Without like picking up the instrument. But composition, took over. It's time consuming, is writing music. Takes a while.
It takes longer than it does to listen to it.
Yes,
that way.
yeah. I don't know many composers who can write in real time.
Being able to compose and really empathically imagine what it's like to play. I imagine you've got quite a close relationship, knowing what it's like to play music as a bassoonist. And then I imagine it would also inform, you can take a leap of faith about the struggles of what it would be like to play another wind instrument and then a string instrument and so on. And you said you have always composed very specifically for instruments. But you also said that the demands of the music that you write are not necessarily your problem. Or maybe I'm paraphrasing. What do you think? How do you see that? Like, not responsibility, but the duty of the composer.
So,
in terms of writing for players.
For humans.
Yeah.
The first thing that we always have to do is understand an instrument's literature.
What do you mean by that?
So, the existing music
right.
written for that instrument.
Right.
so that we know this thing is just a nice way of writing for this instrument. This is how Bach writes for the violin.
Mm-hmm.
This is how Beethoven writes for the violin, how Boulez writes for the violin, how they're different, how they're the same.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you start to understand what the limits of that instrument might be,
Mm-hmm.
how you might be able to push against those limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And also, one of the most important things is to have a physical understanding of the instrument. I had a handful of, well, I say a handful, I had a couple of years of violin lessons in primary school.
Yeah.
I was not a good violinist. It does not.
Well, is anyone in primary school?
No, exactly. Well, some people are. That just physical experience sort of stays with you,
Yeah.
even if you're not very good.
I was wondering why you were talking about the violin specifically. But I guess
But, you
you've
know,
experienced it.
Yeah, and how that might transfer to a cello
Mm-hmm.
is just a matter of logic.
Yeah.
But then, if I were a better string player, and I've definitely seen this from some of my students in the past, you find yourself more limited because you rely on your own technique.
Mm-hmm.
But because you might not be as good anymore as some of your colleagues,
Yeah.
you know, if you were maybe a great high school violinist,
Yeah.
but maybe some of your conservatoire colleagues are, you know, just better. You're limited by your own experience. I've found it very useful to just be freed of the shackles of my own technique. So I can imagine, well, these are the notes. I can imagine that actually I could probably do that with loads of practice. Probably couldn't do it in the middle of a 12-minute piece.
Sure.
But actually all this stuff works.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a piano piece now.
Yeah.
Piano piece here.
He's making piano gestures.
Yes. I don't write for the bassoon very much. But I think now I'd be in a position to revisit the bassoon and be able to work without the limitations of my own technique.
You've transcended that kind of block that maybe you didn't even realize exists.
Yeah, I think so.
During lockdown, I wrote a solo violin piece for this Royal Academy project where I did my master's. And because I'm a violinist principally, I had a real hang-up about writing for the violin because, again, I felt I could only write as well as I could play. And knowing that this was going to be for another player who was definitely better than me, no doubt about that, that was the final thing I needed to unlock and free me up to actually just write the notes I wanted and not be too worried about could I play it though, because I didn't have to, just practically speaking. Have you ever written for solo bassoon?
Once, yeah, as a student.
Right.
I'd love to write another solo bassoon piece, a little bassoon and ensemble piece I have percolating.
Yeah.
It wasn't the kind of piece, it was quite weird for me even then.
Mm-hmm.
It was a sort of very rhythmic, sort of barnstorming solo bassoon piece in that sort of jokey manner that lots of solo bassoon pieces are.
So for context, that's not necessarily the kind of vibe that Steven Daverson's music
Usually
takes
takes.
these days.
No, not full of gags.
No.
My music. But this piece was more light-hearted. I'd like to do a more representative bassoon piece, I think.
But maybe you don't have to play yourself.
Maybe, maybe not. It depends.
Yeah, I'm sure you're very good.
I'd be willing to give it a go.
Good.
I'd be willing to give it a go. I'm actually writing a piece for saxophone and electronics at the moment. And I'm very tempted to see how it works out on the bassoon.
Oh, yeah.
Just as a test piece. It might be actually one of the first pieces that I write imagining that it could be for different instruments, different forces.
Sounds like that would be quite new for you.
Very new, yeah.
To actually be a bit more pragmatic about these are just some notes and give it to someone else.
Yeah, it's definitely something I've been thinking about more, is loosening the stranglehold of the amount of detail that I put into certain parts and the kind of musical materials that I'm working with.
It feels like it would be quite an egalitarian approach. Not that your music is not already, but in terms of increasing the access.
I think so. And even to include certain other parts, if it's for a string instrument, then here are some additional markings that will be useful for you. But it could still be cello or viola or violin. And the electronics would naturally mold themselves around the forces that are present
Yeah.
rather than being absolutely fixed.
There's definitely something to be said for knowing yourself as an artist and knowing just there are limits to how much your ideas can be stretched to be flexible
Yeah.
for the expectations of the world.
Yeah, but I think it's also to do with just understanding or questioning when you might be relying on your habits.
Yes.
You know, am I doing this because I think it's the right thing to be doing? And generally, I think it is. But
Sure.
but actually, you know, a lot of my music's had lots of very short notes in it. What's wrong with long notes? I'd like to write some long notes, please.
Yeah. You gotta
And
think outside your own box.
yeah, but it might be something as simple as that. Why am I writing all these short notes?
Can you think of examples where maybe you've had a commission or something a little out of left field, a suggestion from a player, it's like, write me a piece, where you've had to really reconsider your own approach?
Yeah, definitely. The first piece I wrote with electronics was a commission from the Darmstadt summer schools. They said, you know, this is a provocation. We know that you don't normally write with electronics.
Oh.
We've commissioned somebody else who normally writes electronic music to
Yeah.
write a string quartet.
Oh.
This is how this works. You don't have to take the provocation, and we can talk about that, but this is what we want from you.
Interesting.
You know, I've talked about it in other places too. It perhaps was not my best work
Sure.
in reality, but the provocation was amazing and very welcome. And yeah, she completely changed the way that I think about music. I think once you start playing with electronics, especially live electronics, you know, interactive electronics, it produces different kinds of grammar and different ways of thinking about how musical materials or instruments or sounds very broadly might interact that can be transferred into instrumental writing, but it's not something that instruments themselves necessarily sort of imply.
It's an interesting and creative approach from effectively a commissioner. I feel these days the concept of the curator of a concert or an event or a festival is becoming a bigger role in the way that a curator in a gallery is now kind of like actually they're the star of the show rather than the artist. It's really interesting to think that they were confident enough to ask for things because they knew you guys weren't necessarily going to be comfortable and they were pushing you outside of your box. That as an idea fits really well with Darmstadt.
Yeah, you don't go to Darmstadt if you want an easy time.
No, especially in the audience.
Well, yeah.
I'm just being silly, but there's some truth in humour.
Yes.
For me, anyway.
It's funny because it's true.
Can you tell people who don't know what Darmstadt is the funny way to sum it up?
Well, historically, Darmstadt was the seat of high musical modernism after the war.
Like that ivory tower.
Yeah, the Ivory Tower, some would call it. This hotbed of serial music and a sort of, it feels very journalistic to say a scientific approach to music, but definitely a interest in the nuts and bolts of musical grammar, syntax, I suppose, that can be a little arid to listen to.
That's very diplomatic.
I think it can be very exciting and sort of wild and unkempt
Yeah.
in its best performances. But when you hear that stuff for the first time, it can be tough.
Yeah.
But it stayed an institution that really valued progressive thinking in new music. And through the 60s and 70s, Darmstadt hosted John Cage, as well as Morton Feldman and more American sort of experimental kinds of music
Yeah.
that started to have a lot of influence in Europe, especially John Cage.
they weren't necessarily setting a house style, but more an open approach to experiment.
Yeah, I think it was a mindset.
Probably why they're still going.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say so. I mean, but now we have a much more sort of performance art based aesthetic coming through in Darmstadt, more conceptual work, video, lots of multimedia stuff with Jennifer Walsh, Johannes Kreidler, all these kinds of conceptual or new discipline composer, artist, curator,
Sure.
provocateur.
You mentioned that they asked you to write electronic music or
There will be
explore
some
an
live
electronic
element, yeah.
And your newish piece,
Yes.
new to us in the UK at least,
Yeah.
figures outside a Japcha with snowfall and an abbey in the background.
Yes.
That's the title.
That's the title.
Very evocative title. There's live electronics in that piece, right?
There is, yeah.
So can you tell us just the overview of the piece?
So the piece itself is about 20 minutes, 24 minutes long for orchestra with amplified ensemble at the front.
Right, okay.
And live electronics.
So there's going to be something to look at as well.
Yeah, it's a considerable size ensemble. It's about 70 people altogether. Wow. This is my fifth piece with electronics. It's become a real kind of staple for me, writing with electronics. But it feels like writing for two orchestras and the interaction of the two. Sometimes it's that the electronics provides a backdrop, a kind of evolving environment that the orchestra sit within, and at other times the sounds of the amplified players are taken up into the space and are manipulated in the moment.
You say live electronics in the description of the piece. So does that mean that it's not always the same twice?
No, it's sort of generative, algorithmic. So first of all, it's not a tape. It's not a fixed media track that we're pressing play.
So it's not a backing track?
It's not a backing track.
Right.
That's never really interested me that much. I like the idea that electronics would be as performative as any kind of instrumental music, and with all the imperfections and spontaneity that come with that. What we're doing is we have a collection of perhaps samples that are fixed, but then they're manipulated, they're played at times that overlap, and they're processed in ways that are unpredictable, randomized, creating a similar kind of sound each time, but it's always slightly different weightings and pressures.
I've heard a former recording. I guess was that the German?
That was the
premiere.
That was the world premiere in
premiere.
Cologne. Yes.
Yeah. Of the piece. This figures outside a dacha.
Yes.
And I actually sort of struggled to discern the electronics from the orchestra. Is that a choice?
Yes.
To be so embedded?
Yes. I wanted it to be one sound, one environment. That, especially when you're listening to it on headphones, it's difficult to get the sense of the spatialization. So there are 8 speakers around the audience in the concert hall.
So this is going to be performed at the Barbican, by the way,
right.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. And we're using an actually extended tech setup at the Barbican to fit in with some of the other pieces that are being done on the day, where we've got 2 speakers that are facing the walls. So we've got this sort of extra resonance.
Interesting.
And then 2 loudspeakers that are above the audience.
Wow.
So that we're getting a stronger sense of that 3-dimensional space.
I've never heard of speakers being placed like that.
Yeah, Nono does it.
Composer.
A composer from the 1980s, Italian composer. Yeah, a particular piece, Prometeo, from 1985, does this kind of tech setup. Again, to make something very kind of spacious and diffuse. And that sense of sort of world building is quite important to me. That it should be a strong sense of environment or atmosphere.
There's a very strong atmosphere in the piece. And you mentioned in your sort of liner notes, your press notes, about Andrei Tarkovsky.
Yes.
How is his work present? Because it's obviously not just a Mickey Mouse literalization of one of his films.
No.
but you seem to be painting a picture and a mood in the same way that you see a Tarkovsky film, you're like, whoa, I feel a certain way.
Yeah.
How do you want us to feel?
That's not for me to say.
Right.
I love Tarkovsky. And the title is evoking the very last scene, the very last shot of Nostalgia.
One of his films.
One of his films. Yeah. This long, slow zooming out of a man and a dog in this sort of grassland with a farmhouse in the background. And then as the camera pans out, the whole scene is encased within an abbey, within an Italian abbey. And then as we zoom out further, the camera pauses and snow starts to fall. And it is, at the end of a film, maybe an hour and 45. It's not hugely long. But it has this cosmic quality to it, something metaphysical about it. And I talk about the metaphysical elements of Tarkovsky a lot in relation to this piece and others. It is there to create this bit of magic, sort of paradoxical or memory-like sensation. The fact that you've got this exterior scene, you know, the man, the farmhouse, within an interior scene inside the abbey, and then that appears to be in another exterior scene as it snows. This is paradoxical, it's impossible, but it is happening, and it's beautiful. And that sense of the scale, certainly the size of the scene, is something that comes across quite clearly in the piece.
I'd agree, yeah.
And the way that the spatialization, the use of reverb, sort of artificial resonance within the piece definitely evokes something of being inside a cathedral or in one of these cavernous spaces. And then that cavernous space can be made to feel like it's outside. And it has that distance and sort of dryness that you can only get from being outside with no surfaces to bounce sounds off.
I mean, I've seen the clip you mean, I've not seen the film. It's funny because at first it's so still that I thought, is this just like zooming out on a still image? And then you see the snow falling, you're like, oh wow, this is actually a real-time film.
Yeah. The dog is very well behaved.
Yeah. But there's a kind of suspension of time that's also present in this piece that's being played at the Barbican. Also in other pieces of yours.
Yeah.
It's almost as though the writing for the instruments as well is uncanny and sort of inhabiting the world between notes. It's almost as though you're more interested, if not as interested, in the other sounds that the instruments make besides
the ones that I've asked for.
Well, besides, you know, what you might traditionally see in a score in terms of notes and harmony and so on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely interested in the more unstable qualities of instrumental practice and encouraging people to not be wrong necessarily. The way I describe it to players, especially the ones who are perhaps less keen to be given these challenges.
Because they've just got their job in the orchestra and they have to play what they're told.
Yeah.
Effectively.
You know, and I sympathise. But the best way of describing it is beat your high score. Make it a game. You've got these sounds that are possible on your instrument, but they're unstable. They might not speak immediately or they might not speak at all. But when they do, they're very special sounds. And I think that's a really important part of my music and the music of other composers I'm excited by. It's a kind of energy that you only get by, as far as I'm concerned, by writing something that is doable, but only just. And certainly is very hard to do within the context of a much larger piece. And that imperfection of musical performance is definitely something that I'm interested in.
How do you think players in the BBC Symphony Orchestra who are going to be playing this piece, do you ever spend time thinking about what they might, in their most cynical moments, think about this approach to composing and what you're asking of them, considering like they've spent their whole lives trying to play nice.
Put it this way, there's a reason that I went to the BBC Symphony Orchestra for this.
Okay.
There are performers everywhere who even wouldn't want to play Ligeti or Schoenberg, much more established composers than me, who still don't want to play stuff that isn't tonal. I get that, that's fine, that's just a matter of taste.
Yeah.
First of all, if you're going to work with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, you do it with your eyes open. But also, I don't think any composer goes into a project like this trying to piss people off.
Yes, that's the fundamental first principle, isn't it?
Some would say.
You want to be in the room and you want them to be in the room.
Yeah. God knows there were pieces that I didn't want to play when I was in orchestras, and yeah, they weren't the BBC Symphony Orchestra, but I wasn't getting paid. And I think when you get a piece of mine and you look at those parts, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of notes here. But actually, these parts are presented, like I spend a lot of time on my performance materials, and I make sure that they look really clear. I have done everything I can to make sure that however hard this is for them, they can see that I really care about this.
You're doing your best to communicate what you mean.
If there are ambiguities, they're there for a reason.
They need to trust.
Yeah.
It's funny because in a way, when you write an orchestral piece, when one does, I can't imagine many people have the experience. I have when I was a student, for sure. You're not writing for an anonymous set of instrumentalists. I mean, you are, but fundamentally, each person who receives the score on their desk is another relationship. It's sort of impractical to consider every single individual relationship as a composer. You have to have a cut-off point at some point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's not like writing a string quartet or even a song where you know that you are going to be dealing with those personalities, and maybe there will be other personalities in a few years if you're lucky, but on that day with an orchestra, the only personality you're really going to be interacting with is either the artistic director or the conductor, maybe a soloist.
Conductor, yeah.
Ilan Volkov is going to be conducting this piece, and I'm really excited to be,
You've worked
working
together before
with him. No. I mean, obviously, I've seen his work, and I like how interested Ilan is in just loads of different kinds of music. Just a music fan. I've got a lot of time for that. I'm really sort of keen to sort of pick his brains about certain music that I only know through him.
Yeah.
That will be great fun, but it does mean that when you're writing a piece, and if you don't know who your conductor's going to be, you have no way of gauging what those relationships are going to be like.
Just hoping for the best.
Yeah, but it's very liberating in that sense. It's like, this really is just about the piece.
Yeah.
It's the only thing I have any control over. I'm the only person that this piece is going to follow.
Sure.
Everybody else in this project, gets to do their own stuff independently of this piece.
Yeah.
The example I talk about quite a bit is Brian Ferneyhough. He still, until quite recently, was going to, Darmstadt and hearing these flute pieces being played that he wrote in the late 60s, early 70s. It's like, bloody hell, Brian, you must love this music. And he does, it still means a lot to him to hear this music. But it sort of strikes me that if I didn't write music that I really wanted to hear, if I pulled those punches, if I didn't have the courage to be like, no, this is for this awkward instrument that you're going to have to pay a little bit extra to get hold of, I would go around for all the other performances, if I'm lucky, being like, wish I'd done it differently.
If only.
If only. I don't want that, because everybody else gets to walk away.
Sure. Gosh, I never thought about it that way, as the piece that you write. Not being a noose exactly, but it's
a commitment.
Yeah, it's like making a child, and then you have to feed it.
But if I don't believe in it, why should anybody else?
Yes, true. I have no doubt of over all the years that I've known you that you aren't fully committed to what you present to a player, and that you expect people to listen to. In terms of that relationship with the conductor, that's quite a specific relationship, a composer-conductor. But as a composer, you're not only having to do the composing job.
No.
Can you talk about some of the other roles?
You mean being
either you
catering and
impose upon yourself.
finance and...
Yeah, well, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. I've spoken about this before in my podcast about what does it actually mean to be a self-releasing artist. It's probably only 2% composing.
Yeah. It's a lot of effort to get projects off the ground.
Mm.
And I'm not somebody who writes loads of music, and I'm not somebody who necessarily wants to write loads of music just because. I don't write if I'm not being paid, generally speaking.
Interesting.
That's a matter of principle for me.
Yeah.
That does mean that I might write 1 or 2 pieces a year. That's enough for me. You've talked about overthinking and overdoing, and I think there's a lot of that too. There's certainly a lot of overthinking. I think it's really important to be able to take that time to actually assess what you're doing. And I don't like the model of writing 6 pieces, 4 of them aren't very good, 3 of them get withdrawn, and that's how it goes on, because you don't give yourself enough time to actually think about what it is you're doing.
Yeah.
It works for some people, it doesn't work for me. For me, there's a lot of time spent going for coffee with people, talking about how a project is going to be funded, how to present it, how to frame it in ways that are going to give it some visibility or viability even. And it's time consuming. But I teach, and that at least means that I'm able to keep the wolf from the door.
Yeah.
And write the stuff that matters to me for people that want it, even if it takes a long time to get projects moving.
What is it that keeps you going? Because for me, I've joked recently that I could probably make a comfortable enough living teaching music as I do at home 1-to-1, and then I could probably just be off the rest of the time. No one is asking me to make a podcast or release songs. I mean, I have a few very kind listeners who say, "When's your album coming?" But which keeps
your album coming?
Yes, stay tuned. I've got one album coming out this year, but it's not about me. I'm sure I'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about music for dance unseen coming out soon. How are you still going?
Oh, yeah.
Is there a need?
Well, look, there is a need, and I've been obsessed with music for as long as I can remember, but it's not so much that I get up in the morning and I have to be writing notes. I can go for quite a long time without writing anything and be perfectly happy, but there is something nourishing about it. Obviously, we had a pandemic where nobody was performing anything, and that first performance after the pandemic, having not heard any of my music, let alone a new piece, and the only way I can describe it is like being able to taste your grandmother's cooking again. And it was just like, wow. It is nourishing.
Yeah.
That nobody else's sounds, and I love a lot of music, but nobody's sounds hit home the way your own sounds do.
That's so nice to hear, not least because your music, well, it takes commitment to listen to, I think. I'm trying to find not just a diplomatic way of putting it, but from my personal perspective, I know I've studied contemporary classical music, and I still find a certain kind of music like, okay, this is really, you go to the gallery and you sit and you watch the video film. You might not necessarily sit and watch it if you're at home where you're being distracted, but you make the commitment to go to the concert and hear your piece played, and it's like a real event. But it's just so nice to know there's that emotional connection behind it.
There absolutely is.
Yeah.
And I think we talk about the nuts and bolts of music to have something to talk about in a way. It's useful, we're teachers, so we want to have stuff to teach. That's not why I do what I do, but those techniques are always there in the service of something more expressive. If they weren't expressive, I wouldn't use them. There's always been that emotional quality about it for me.
That's undoubted, from what I've heard.
Yeah. I've never been somebody, well, no, that's not true. I have at some point been somebody who is just interested in what these techniques do. What do
Like
they create?
compositional
Yeah.
techniques, yeah.
But then, even if that's the starting point of a piece, you have to be able to take a step back and say, well, what is the emotional situation here? What are the implications of this? What does this sound like? Can I make it sound more like that? And it becomes an expressive environment.
This concert on the 23rd at the Barbican, 23rd of
Yes.
February, is going to be a real event in that sense, that it's a happening, as my older friend Anne says. She used to run a gallery in central London, and she loved to talk about my work as happenings. I would think that's not what I call it, but the older I get, the more I realize how rare it is for these happenings to actually happen.
Yes.
And how you really have to be there and have the ticket and turn up and experience it. Can you predict how you're going to feel during the concert?
Well, I'm going to be at the desk doing some of the electronics, I
You'll be
think.
working.
So I will be working. I will be not as nervous as I was at the first performance, but still apprehensive.
It's probably healthy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
reassuring.
In other pieces, when I haven't had the same kind of sort of technical involvement and I can just sit and listen, I'm far less bothered by those because at that point I've done the rehearsals, I've obviously written the piece, my involvement is sort of done. But obviously I want people to enjoy it, I want the performance to go well, but I have no way of improving it one way or another.
It's quite a powerless situation,
It is.
isn't it?
And I think
it's a very unique position.
Yeah, but again, I find it liberating.
Because you have
I just, there is nothing I can do here.
Except
if this goes
enjoy it.
badly, okay.
Yeah.
You can be nervous about how, I don't know, maybe an unenlightened press might view a performance that doesn't go well. You know, you've got a group that has a cast iron reputation, completely hoons a piece of yours. And they think that it's just a badly written piece. Now, luckily, that hasn't happened to me.
And it won't.
And it won't. It's not to say that it hasn't ever happened.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that I think you can really be nervous about.
Yeah.
But even then, it's like, what are you going to do about it?
We're alive, we're experiencing this.
Yeah.
I remember the last time I was lucky enough to have any of my music played by performers was actually at the Barbican as well. And it was a project with the London Symphony Orchestra where I was working with Fraser Trainer, this incredible creative workshop leader, and we'd made some music with some young people, and my job was basically to embed their music that they had written and memorized, 12 minutes of music, and they were performing live, into an orchestral landscape so the others could play along with them. And so it was a kind of egoless job. It was a very specific brief that I just had to make everyone sound good. Maybe, there was a 5% space for me to put some of myself in there as well to try and also enjoy the experience. And I remember being in the audience with this very specific attitude for gratitude because the rehearsal, all 8 minutes of the rehearsal, could have been quite painful. I realised I just had to put my blinkers on about what it is that was happening right now, despite all of the backstage politics and any kind of niggles that had happened that day about being credited in the projections or whatever, and any kind of misunderstandings with the conductor. Fundamentally, I had written some notes and they were on desks in front of the LSO, who I had admired for my entire life ever since I watched E.T. I was in a room with a full audience also listening to those notes being played, and however well it went or didn't, I was just like, wow, how many people on the planet can have this experience? It was very humbling and very liberating in a way when you realise, well, I can't do anything now. I handed it in 6 weeks ago and all I'm doing is witnessing it. And I'm so excited for you to experience it yourself, because you will actually also then be the main event. You're the point of that experience.
Yeah, I suppose so.
But you wrote it,
I wrote it.
Your name is in capital letters.
Yeah.
At the head of the credits.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. This is a Steven Daverson production.
No pressure.
It's funny because I don't write this stuff thinking I want people to be thinking about me all the way through this.
No, of course, no. But they are all there in their seats with their tickets to hear
Yeah.
what came from your brain.
Yes, me and Misato Mochizuki and Tristan Mirai as well.
Yes, of course. Were also being performed.
Yes.
You have mentioned a few times you're a teacher, and you still teach composition, I guess. And like I've said, I teach. What's your advice for any of your students that might be listening that you might not think to tell them in a formal lesson setting? Have you got any advice as a composer or a musician or just how to be a nice human?
It's a very good question. How to be a nice human.
What is it that you might have learned along your way from being a student yourself to now teaching at the place you used to learn that you've realised, oh, it's not about that actually, it's about this?
I think the big lesson that it took me a while to realise was that any educational institution is an artificial situation. And we try to prepare our students for the realities of music industry or whatever you want to call it, the profession. But being that productive and having that much time to be productive is not sustainable. It certainly wasn't for me. You know, I was in conservatoires for 11 years altogether, and coming out of that and having all the support and being part of this circuit of opportunities or, you know, young composers programs that kept me visible, kept me composing, sort of came to an end. And you realize that you can't be writing that much all the time. It took me a long while to realize that I wasn't a failure because I wasn't still working the way I was as a student. I think that writing 1 or 2 pieces a year is a luxury. First of all, I'd never really expect composition like this to pay for, you know, a lavish lifestyle. But I think it's very easy to get into that mindset of, well, I'm not being productive enough, I'm not being productive enough. It's like, yeah, well, you don't have a scholarship and you don't have somebody who's breathing down your neck because they've got to do an assessment for you in 6 months.
You're not just producing to fulfill their system.
Yeah, you have to create your own system to fulfill. And whatever system there might be, like you said, you know, whatever system there might be might not necessarily be asking you for what you're doing and having to create your own projects. Yes, there are some composers who are able to maintain that degree of activity because for whatever reason, you know, they're writing a particular kind of music that ensembles want at the moment. I think about it a little bit like Quentin Tarantino was talking in an interview about being a writer-director. He's not somebody who goes into the big database of Hollywood scripts that have been greenlit already. You're saying, oh, yeah, I can do one of them. There are lots of directors who would and can make 2 films a year because they've got a screenplay that's already ratified, already sorted out. But Tarantino wants to make everything from scratch. Whatever your opinion about Tarantino, he hasn't done very much, but you can tell this is absolutely his work.
He really meant it.
He really meant it. I much prefer that kind of writer-director, auteur approach than churning out the same stuff. And I know composers who do it.
I've definitely had to create my own system to keep going and to release stuff. Once I realised that one could release your own music if you have recorded it yourself and own the master tape and so on, it was like, wow, okay, I can just run with this and release whatever I like. But then, of course, the filter comes and it's like, well, I can't just release everything. It has to really matter.
Yeah.
And that's part of the overthinking that I struggle with. That crux of just get on with it, just let go, release it so you can work on something else versus, but it has to be worth people's time to listen to. So for you, as a composer or as a musician, deep down, what's the point? And I don't mean that in a cynical way.
No, and I'm not going to give you a cynical answer. I just think if I can create something that puts a little bit more beauty into the world, that is a good thing.
Hurrah.
I really believe that. We can talk forever about the uses of political work, or the role of the composer in society. And I think that those things are really important and valid. But we've all seen, directly or indirectly, horror. And I just think that rather than creating music that reflects the horror and presents the horror again, trying to do something to counterbalance it might be the more responsible thing to do.
Nice. I knew there was a reason we were friends. I agree. So finally, shall we give you a little plug for your upcoming event of the season?
Yes, Figures Outside a Dacha with Snowfall and an Abbey in the background is going to be performed at the Barbican Centre at 3 o'clock on the 23rd of February
2025.
2025. And there will also be a pre-concert talk with Tom Service
Oh, fantastic.
at 11 o'clock.
That'll be very informative for me.
Yeah.
I wish I'd heard that first.
Well,
But I liked our chat.
yes, no, I loved our chat. Yeah, it's been really good to have you around. Yeah, catch up.
Oh, thank you. I remember chatting with you years ago when you were in London, definitely before the pandemic. And we just went for a coffee and had a chat about music. And I remember possibly saying at the end, oh, I wish we'd recorded this because, it was really interesting. And I just wish other people had heard it. Back then I had no idea that I would do a podcast. But I'm so glad that we've got to do it.
Yeah, no, it's been great to do. And I've enjoyed listening to the episodes of your podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Thanks.
I'm enjoying it.
Is there anything else in the future that we want to know about?
I have a piece coming up in Darmstadt, the saxophone and live electronics piece that I'm still working on. I don't have the date for that just yet.
Sure. Is there somewhere people can follow you?
Yes, I'm on Instagram, Steven Daverson _ and my website is www.stevendaverson.com.
Fantastic.
Lovely.
Steven with a V.
With a V, yes.
Great. We'll see you there. Thank you so much, Steven.
Thank you.
Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review this podcast. And if you like it, share it with your friends or on social media. You can find me on social platforms at Deep Down with Jordan Hunt and at Jordan Hunt Music. Deep Down uses bits of my music from my song Ocean Floor, and you can listen to my music on all streaming services. I'd love to hear from you via DM or via my website, jordan-hunt.com, if any of these experiences resonated with you, and there you can sign up to the mailing list for announcements and updates. Thank you so much for listening.